Hello everyone, welcome back to Whisper Tales channel. Before we get started, comment below where you are from and what time you are watching. And did you know that 97% of you guys watching aren't subscribed yet? So make sure to subscribe and like. Alright, let's get into it. Story 1. The Watchers of Ellesmere Island. In the summer of 2023, a research team traveled to Ellesmere Island in Nunavut, Canada's northernmost territory. Dr. Sabine Mercier led the expedition, a geologist studying the effects of climate change on permafrost. Her team consisted of climatologist Dr. Henrik Voss, biologist Yasmin Farouk, and field technician Tobias Renault. They established a camp at 82 degrees north latitude, less than 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole. The landscape was stark beyond description. Ice and rock extending to the horizon, mountains scraped bare by glaciers, valleys filled with permanent ice. In summer, the sun never set, circling the sky 24 hours a day, creating a timeless twilight that felt alien and wrong to human circadian rhythms. On their third day, Tobias found something while setting up monitoring equipment. A structure. Not natural, not modern. He called the others, and they walked half a kilometer from camp to see what he'd discovered. It was a cairn, but unlike any they'd seen before. 5 meters tall, constructed from stones carved with precision and fitted together without mortar. And the stones themselves were wrong. This was sedimentary rock country, but these stones were igneous, granite, impossibly heavy, and they'd been moved here from somewhere else and arranged with clear purpose. The cairn was surrounded by smaller stones arranged in concentric circles, creating a pattern that looked astronomical or ceremonial. And carved into the largest stone at the base of the cairn was a symbol. An eye, stylized but unmistakable, looking upward. "This can't be Thule or Dorset culture," Yasmin said. "The engineering is too advanced, and these stones are thousands of years old based on weathering patterns." "Who builds something like this 800 kilometers from the North Pole?" Henrik wondered. Dr. Mercier examined the eye symbol. "Let's document this and report it. This is archaeological, not geological. We're not equipped to excavate properly." But that night, sleeping in their tents under the midnight sun, Dr. Mercier woke to a sound. A low-frequency hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. She unzipped her tent and stepped out into the pale light. The cairn was glowing. Not brightly, just a faint luminescence, as if the stones themselves were generating light. And the hum was coming from it, vibrating through the permafrost, through the air. The others emerged from their tents, all awakened by the sound. They approached the cairn carefully. The glow intensified as they got closer, and the hum grew louder, creating harmonics that made their teeth ache. Then the glow spread. It moved outward from the cairn across the landscape, illuminating the ground in patches, creating a pattern. From ground level, it was meaningless. But Henrik pulled out his drone and launched it. On the drone's camera, viewed from above, the pattern was clear. The glowing patches formed an image. The same eye symbol from the cairn, but massive, maybe a kilometer across, with the cairn at its center. And the eye was looking up at the drone, at the sky, at something beyond. "What the hell is this?" Tobias whispered. The glow faded. The hum stopped. The landscape returned to its normal gray and white stillness. But they'd all seen it. The eye, vast and ancient, activated by their presence, looking at something in the sky. They decided to leave. This was beyond their expertise, beyond their understanding. They'd document everything and report it to the proper authorities. But when they returned to their camp, something had changed. Their equipment was arranged differently, not dramatically but subtly. Tents were 5 meters from where they'd been pitched. Supply crates were stacked in a different order. and on the ground in the center of their camp, arranged in small rocks, was a message. They're watching. They've always been watching. None of them had written it. None of them would admit to it being a prank. The stones were permafrost stones, half frozen to the ground, and moving them would have required tools and time. Dr. Mercier checked the timestamp on their data recorders. According to the machines, 3 hours had passed while they'd been at the cairn, but it had felt like 30 minutes. They'd lost time, or time had lost them. That night, none of them slept. They huddled in one tent, watching the landscape through the translucent walls, and in the eternal twilight, they saw things moving. Figures, tall and thin, barely visible against the ice, walking slowly around their camp in a wide circle, never approaching, just watching. Could be caribou, Henrik suggested, but no one believed him. Could be other researchers, Tobias said, but there were no other camps within 200 kilometers. Yasmin had her binoculars. She focused on one of the figures. Then she lowered the binoculars, her hands shaking. Those aren't human. They're not animal. There's something else. The figures circled all night, never coming closer, never moving away. As the hours passed, more figures appeared. Dozens of them, all maintaining the same distance, all watching with patient stillness. At what should have been morning, though the sun looked no different than it had at midnight, Dr. Mercier made a decision. We're evacuating. Now. Leave everything that's not essential. They packed emergency supplies and started hiking toward their pickup coordinates, 40 kilometers away. The figures followed, matching their pace, maintaining their distance, always watching. The hike took 2 days. They didn't stop to sleep, driven by fear and the need to reach safety. The figures never left them, never got closer, but their numbers grew. Hundreds of them by the second day, a silent procession of watchers surrounding the 4 humans as they fled across the barren landscape. When the helicopter finally arrived at the pickup point, Dr. Mercier looked back one last time. The figures stood in a perfect circle around the landing site, and as the helicopter lifted off, she saw them all look up, tracking the aircraft with synchronized movements. From the air, she saw more. Scattered across Ellesmere Island were more cairns, dozens of them, and around each one, more circles of stones, more patterns, a network of ancient structures, all focused on the sky, all watching for something. Back in civilization, the research team tried to report their findings, but when they checked their data, everything from the camp was corrupted. Photos showed only static. Video recordings were blank. The GPS coordinates they'd marked for the cairn led to empty ice fields when satellite imagery was checked. It was as if the site had been erased from their records. Only their memories remained. And the knowledge that something ancient lives in the Arctic, something that predates human history. The cairns are their constructions, their observatories, built to watch the sky for arrivals or departures or threats. And the tall, thin watchers who circled the camp aren't gone. They're still there, in the most remote and inhospitable place on Earth, maintaining their vigil. Dr. Mercier never returned to the Arctic. None of her team did. But sometimes, late at night, she pulls up satellite imagery of Ellesmere Island and scans the landscape. She's looking for the cairns, for evidence that what they saw was real. She never finds them. The images show only ice and rock. But she knows they're there, hidden by technology or geography or something beyond understanding. The watchers are there, maintaining their ancient vigil, looking at the sky with those cairn-marked eyes, waiting for whatever they've been watching for through millennia of frozen darkness. And the most terrifying part, the thing that keeps Dr. Mercier awake at night, is a simple question. What are they watching for? What do they expect to see? And what will happen when it finally arrives? Story 2. The Fog Bank of Twilling. Commercial fisherman Declan Moss had been working the waters off Newfoundland's coast for 23 years. He knew the sea, knew its moods, knew how to read the weather, and respect the ocean's power. In October of 2021, he took his boat, the Mary Catherine, out for what should have been a routine cod fishing trip near Twilling. His crew consisted of his nephew Riley, age 22, and a seasonal worker named Garrett Blackwood, who'd fished these waters for 3 seasons. They left port at 4 a.m., planning to fish the grounds about 30 kilometers offshore and return by evening. The morning was clear and cold, the sea relatively calm. They reached their fishing grounds and began working their lines. By noon, they'd had good success, their hold already half full of cod. Declan was considering heading in early when Riley pointed to the horizon. Fog. A bank of it so thick and white it looked solid, like a wall, and it was moving toward them with impossible speed. In his 23 years fishing these waters, Declan had never seen fog move like that. It rolled across the ocean surface, consuming everything in its path. "Secure everything!" Declan shouted. They pulled in their lines, stowed loose equipment, and Declan fired up the engines to outrun the fog. But it was too fast. The Mary Catherine could make 15 knots at full power, and the fog was gaining on them, moving at least twice that speed. The fog engulfed them. One moment they were in bright autumn sunlight. The next they were wrapped in white, so thick Declan couldn't see the bow of his own boat from the wheelhouse. All his instruments went haywire. The GPS showed their position jumping randomly. The depth sounder read impossible depths, 100 meters, then 5,000, then 200. The compass spun lazily, pointing in all directions and none. And then the sound started. Voices, calling from the fog, men's voices shouting, panicking, the sound of wood splintering, screams, the roar of something massive moving through water. Riley came into the wheelhouse, his face white. "Uncle Deck, I can see things. Ships, old ships. They're all around us." Declan looked out the wheelhouse windows. Through the fog, visible only in fragments, were vessels. Sailing ships, wooden hulls, some intact, some broken. All of them wrong, impossible, existing in a space that should have been empty ocean. Ghost ships, phantom vessels, all of them calling out, their crews screaming warnings that came too late. Garrett joined them in the wheelhouse. "My grandfather told me stories," he said, "about a fog that comes sometimes off these waters, a fog that shows you the drowned. Every ship that ever went down, every sailor who died in these waters, they're all caught in the fog. It's like a net," he said, "catching souls." "That's just stories," Riley said, but his voice held no conviction. The Mary Catherine drifted, engines running but making no headway. They were caught in the fog, surrounded by echoes of maritime disasters. Through the white, Declan saw the broken hull of a schooner, sails in tatters, deck tilted at an impossible angle. He saw men clinging to rigging, calling for help in accents from another century. He saw a modern trawler, its deck crushed by something massive, crew members frozen in the moment of their deaths, trapped in an eternal last second. "We need to contact the Coast Guard," Riley said. But the radio produced only screaming. Dozens of voices, overlapping, all calling Mayday, all giving different coordinates, all reporting disasters separated by decades or centuries. Hours passed, or minutes. Time felt wrong, elastic, stretching and compressing. Garrett started seeing people he knew. His grandfather, who drowned in 2004, his uncle, lost at sea in 1997. Both of them standing on the deck of the Mary Catherine, soaking wet, mouths open in silent screams. "They're not here," Declan said firmly. "It's the fog. It's showing us things to break us." But then Declan saw something that made his blood freeze. A woman, standing at the bow of the Mary Catherine. She wore a life jacket with the name Mary Catherine stenciled on it. She was looking back at the wheelhouse, her face showing terror and resignation in equal measure. And she was Riley's girlfriend, Cassandra, who Declan knew was safely on shore in Twillingate. "Why is Cassie here?" Riley asked, seeing her too. "I didn't tell her we were going out today." Declan understood with horrible clarity. "She's not here, not yet. The fog isn't just showing us the past, it's showing us the future. It's showing us our own deaths." The fog was a place outside time. Past and future existed simultaneously here, all maritime disasters overlapping, all drownings happening at once in an eternal present. And the Mary Catherine was now part of that eternal moment, caught in the net with all the other lost vessels. Riley ran out onto the deck, trying to reach the apparition of his girlfriend. Garrett grabbed him, pulling him back. "Don't touch them. If you touch them, you become them. You become part of the fog." Declan made a decision. He killed the engines. The sudden silence was profound. In the quiet, they could hear the fog itself, a sound like breathing, like waves, like wind through sails, all mixed together into a susurrus that seemed almost alive. "My grandfather said there was a way out," Garrett spoke quietly. "The fog only keeps you if you fight it, if you try to navigate, if you run, if you struggle. But if you accept it, if you drift and let the water take you, sometimes it lets you go." It went against every instinct Declan had. Every lesson he'd learned said to fight, to navigate, to never give up control. But normal navigation wasn't working. The instruments were useless. The engines couldn't outrun the fog. They were caught in something beyond normal maritime disaster. Declan shut down all the systems. No engines, no electronics, just the Mary Catherine drifting in the fog at the mercy of current and tide. He led Riley and Garrett inside the wheelhouse and told them to close their eyes, to not look at the apparitions, to ignore the voices. They drifted. Time passed in unmeasurable increments. The voices around them grew louder, more desperate. The fog pressed against the windows like it was alive, wanting in. The apparitions of drowning sailors crowded the deck, all of them looking at Declan and his crew with envy or hunger or accusation. And then, gradually, the voices began to fade. The fog started to thin. The pressure eased. The Mary Catherine drifted on, and slowly, impossibly, the fog released them. They emerged into evening light. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and red. Their instruments flickered back to life, showing a position 35 kilometers from where they'd been when the fog hit. The GPS worked. The compass pointed true north. The depth sounder showed a reasonable 40 meters. They made it back to port that night, their hold still half full of cod. No one believed their story. The Coast Guard had no record of unusual fog banks. Weather satellites showed clear conditions for the entire day. Other boats that had been fishing nearby saw nothing unusual. But Declan, Riley, and Garrett knew. The fog was real. The trapped vessels were real. All the drowned sailors caught in an eternal moment of dying, they were all real. And the fog was still out there, moving across the ocean, collecting new victims, adding to its endless collection of maritime deaths. Declan retired after that trip. He sold the Mary Catherine, couldn't bear to go out on her again. Riley gave up fishing entirely, moved inland, as far from the ocean as he could get. Only Garrett kept working the water, but he watches the horizon constantly, and whenever he sees fog forming, no matter how benign it looks, he heads for port immediately. Because he knows the truth. The ocean keeps what drowns in it. Every sailor lost at sea is still out there, trapped in fog, replaying their final moments forever. And on certain days, in certain conditions, that fog rolls in, looking for new souls to add to its collection. If you're ever fishing off Newfoundland's coast and you see fog moving faster than fog should move, heading toward you with purpose and hunger, run. Don't try to navigate through it. Don't try to outrun it. Just run for shore as fast as your boat can carry you. And if you get caught, if the fog wraps around you and shows you phantom ships and drowning men, remember Garrett Blackwood's grandfather's advice. Don't fight it. Drift. Let go. Sometimes, only sometimes, the fog will let you go. But it will keep a part of you. A small piece, a memory, a moment. And for the rest of your life, whenever fog rolls in, you'll feel it calling you back, reminding you that you belong to it, that someday you'll return to its embrace and join all the other drowned souls, forever trapped in that eternal moment between living and death. Story 3. The Sinkhole of Saskatoon. In April of 2022, city worker Kendrick Halverson was investigating a water main break in a residential neighborhood in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. The break had created a small sinkhole in someone's front yard, nothing unusual for a city with aging infrastructure. Kendrick and his crew arrived with equipment to assess the damage and make repairs. The homeowner, a nervous man named Lionel Prata, met them at the door. "I don't think this is a normal sinkhole," he said. "You need to see it." The sinkhole was about 2 meters in diameter, edges crumbling into darkness. Kendrick set up lights and lowered a camera into the hole, expecting to see the broken water main and maybe some washed-out soil. What the camera revealed made him call his supervisor immediately. The hole didn't lead to a cavity created by erosion. It led to a chamber, man-made. Stone walls, carved with precision, extending down at least 10 meters. And there were stairs, cut into the stone, descending into darkness. The city sent engineers, then archaeologists. The chamber predated Saskatoon's establishment as a city. It predated European settlement entirely. The stonework was ancient, the techniques used to carve it unknown to modern experts. And the stairs went deep. Much deeper than made sense for this location. They decided to explore. A team of 3. Kendrick, an archaeologist named Dr. Fiona Larkin, and a structural engineer named Hayato Tanaka. They wore safety equipment, carried lights and communication devices, and descended into Lionel Pratt's front yard with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The stairs went down 30 meters, then 40, then 50. The chamber walls were covered in carvings. Not any language or writing system Dr. Larkin recognized. The symbols were geometric, repetitive, and they seemed to spiral downward, following the descent of the stairs. At 70 meters depth, they reached a landing. A doorway opened into a larger chamber, and when they entered, their lights revealed something that shouldn't exist. A city. Underground. Carved entirely from the surrounding stone, buildings and streets and plazas all in perfect miniature. None of the structures more than a meter tall. It was a model, a representation, but the detail was extraordinary. Every building had windows, doors, even tiny furniture visible through the openings. "This is impossible," Dr. Larkin whispered. "The geological surveys show nothing but bedrock and clay at this depth. There shouldn't be a cavity this size." Kendrick walked among the miniature buildings, his flashlight revealing more and more details. In one plaza, there were tiny figures. Stone people, carved with incredible precision, frozen in various poses. Shopping, talking, going about daily life. In another area, the figures were running, their faces turned toward one direction, expressions of terror captured in stone. At the center of the miniature city was a building larger than the others, a cathedral or temple, its architecture suggesting reverence and importance. The doors were open. Inside, Kendrick could see more figures, all of them prostrate, all facing a central altar. And on the altar, something that made him step back in instinctive fear. A hole. A perfectly circular hole carved into the stone altar, darkness visible within, and the hole seemed deeper than should be possible given the altar's size. Dr. Larkin was examining the carvings on the chamber walls. These symbols repeat. They're instructions, I think. Or warnings. She traced one sequence with her finger. This looks like a countdown? Or a cycle? Something that happens in stages. Hayato had been checking their structural surroundings, ensuring the chamber was stable. He called out from near the entrance. "We have a problem. The doorway we entered through. It's different." They rushed back to the landing. The doorway had changed. The stone had shifted, growing narrower, the edges moving inward like a slowly closing mouth. The stairs beyond were no longer visible. They tried to go back through, but the opening was too narrow now, and it was still closing. Hayato estimated they had maybe 20 minutes before it sealed completely. "There has to be another exit," Kendrick said. They searched the chamber frantically, their lights dancing across the miniature city. And they found it. Another doorway, on the opposite side of the chamber. This one was open wide, leading to more descending stairs. "We don't know where that leads," Dr. Larkin said. "And we know this doorway is closing. We don't have a choice." They descended deeper. These stairs were different, cruder, carved in a hurry, perhaps. The walls were plain, no carvings, no decoration. Just stone and darkness and the sound of their breathing amplified by the enclosed space. After another 50 meters of descent, they reached a second chamber. This one was not carved from the surrounding stone. It was a natural cave, massive and ancient. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like teeth. Underground pools of water reflected their lights. And in the center of the cavern, they saw it. A pit. Enormous, at least 50 meters across, descending into absolute darkness. The miniature city above had been built around a representation of this pit. The tiny hole on the altar had been a model. This was the reality. Kendrick approached the edge carefully. The stone around the pit was worn smooth, as if millions of hands or feet had walked this path over countless years. He aimed his flashlight down into the pit. The beam was swallowed by darkness. He dropped a rock. They waited for the sound of it hitting bottom. They never heard it land. "We need to leave," Hayato said. "Now." But they'd come down a one-way passage. The doorway at the top of these stairs, when they checked, was also closing. They were being pushed deeper, or something was pulling them deeper. Dr. Larkin found more carvings on the cave walls. "It's a ritual," she said, her voice shaking. "People came down here. They made offerings to the pit, and sometimes—" She stopped, her light fixed on a particular sequence of symbols. Sometimes the pit demanded more than offerings. It demanded tribute, people. They were thrown in, sacrificed to whatever is down there. The cave began to rumble. Small rocks fell from the ceiling. The underground pools rippled. Something was moving in the pit. Something massive, shifting in the darkness far below, responding to their presence. "We need to find another way out," Kendrick said, trying to keep panic out of his voice. They explored the cavern's perimeter, searching for any passage, any escape route. The rumbling grew louder. The pit was breathing now. They could feel it. Great drafts of cold air rising from the depths, bringing with them a smell like ancient rot and stone. Hayato found it. A narrow crack in the cave wall, barely wide enough to squeeze through. "It might lead up. It's our only chance." They forced themselves through the crack, scraping skin, losing equipment, driven by the primal need to escape. The passage angled upward sharply, more of a chimney than a tunnel. They climbed, wedging themselves between the walls, their lights revealing only the next few meters of ascent. Hours of climbing. Their muscles screamed. Their hands bled. But the passage continued upward, and eventually they saw it. Light. Real light. Daylight. They emerged not in Lionel Pratta's front yard, but 3 kilometers away, in a park on the outskirts of Saskatoon. A hiker found them, covered in blood and stone dust, and called for emergency services. When authorities investigated Lionel's yard, the sinkhole had collapsed entirely. The entrance to the chambers was gone, filled in with tons of soil and rock. Ground-penetrating radar showed no cavities below. It was as if the underground chambers had never existed. But Kendrick, Dr. Larkin, and Hayato knew better. They'd seen the miniature city. They'd felt the presence in the pit. And they knew that somewhere deep beneath Saskatoon, ancient chambers still existed, hidden behind walls of stone and time. The pit was still there, still waiting, still breathing in the darkness. Construction projects in Saskatoon occasionally uncover things. Old artifacts, strange stone structures, carvings that don't match any known culture. The official response is always the same. Unknown origin, possibly indigenous, requires further study. Then the artifacts disappear into storage, the sites are covered over, construction continues. Because acknowledging the truth would raise too many questions. Questions about who built those chambers, and when, and why. Questions about what lives in the pit, and whether it's still hungry. Questions about the sacrifices that were made over centuries, and whether those sacrifices kept something contained that should never be released. Lionel Pratt sold his house and moved away. The new owners have no idea what lies beneath their front yard. They water their lawn, play with their children, live normal lives, unaware that meters below them, in darkness and silence, ancient chambers wait. The doorways cycle open and closed, following patterns carved in stone thousands of years ago. And in the deepest chamber, the pit breathes, patient and eternal, waiting for the day when someone descends far enough and doesn't find a way back out. Story 4. The Last Train to Churchill. In the winter of 2016, VIA rail conductor Philippa Crane was working the Hudson Bay route from Winnipeg to Churchill, Manitoba. It's one of Canada's most remote rail lines, 1,000 kilometers through boreal forest, frozen muskeg, and tundra, ending in Churchill on the shore of Hudson Bay. The train only ran twice a week in winter, carrying supplies and the few hardy souls willing to make the 2-day journey. This particular trip in February carried 12 passengers, a skeleton crew, and a cargo car full of supplies for Churchill's isolated community. Philippa had been working this route for 8 years, and she loved it despite the harsh conditions. The stark beauty of the landscape, the quiet camaraderie among the regular passengers, the sense of adventure that came with traveling through true wilderness. The first day passed normally. They departed Winnipeg on schedule, made their stops at small communities along the line, and settled into the rhythm of winter rail travel. The passengers were a mix of Churchill residents returning home, a few tourists hoping to see the northern lights, and a wildlife biologist named Dr. Leena Koskinen, who was heading to the Churchill Northern Studies Center. On the second morning, as they crossed through the transition zone between boreal forest and tundra, the train stopped. Not at a station, just stopped, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by snow-covered muskeg and stunted spruce trees. Philippa made her way to the locomotive to check with the engineer, Walter Briggs, a veteran with 30 years on this route. Walter was staring at the track ahead, his face pale. "What's wrong?" Philippa asked. Walter pointed. Ahead on the tracks, barely visible in the blowing snow, was another train. Same model locomotive, same blue and yellow VIA rail colors. Stopped on the tracks, blocking their path. "I'll radio Churchill, see what's going on," Walter said. But the radio produced only static. He tried the satellite phone. Same result. Something's interfering with communications. They decided Philippa and one of the other crew members would walk up to the stopped train and investigate. Maybe it was a freight train that had broken down. Maybe the crew needed help. It was only 100 meters ahead. As they approached, Philippa realized something was wrong. The stopped train looked old. Not antique, exactly, but the paint was more faded than it should be, the windows darker. And there was no movement visible, no crew checking the locomotive, no passengers looking out windows. They climbed aboard the locomotive. It was empty. Engine still running, but no one at the controls. Philippa walked back through the passenger cars. Also empty. But there were signs of recent occupancy. Coffee cups still steaming on tables. A book open to a marked page. Luggage in the overhead racks. But no people. In the last car, Philippa found a conductor's logbook. She opened it and felt ice water flood her veins. The last entry was dated February 24th, 2016. Today's date. And it was written in her handwriting. Stopped on tracks. Investigating strange train ahead. Philippa Crane, conductor. She ran back to their own train, her heart pounding. When she climbed aboard and entered their passenger car, she stopped cold. Dr. Leena Koskinen was standing at the window, staring out at the abandoned train. "That's our train," Leena said quietly. "What are you talking about?" "That train ahead of us. I just saw myself walk past one of the windows." Philippa looked at the other passengers. They were all staring at the abandoned train now, all of them pale, all of them seeing something that terrified them. One of the tourists, a man named Gregory Wen, spoke up. "I saw my girlfriend looking out that window, but she's sitting right here next to me." "It's a temporal anomaly," Dr. Koskinen said. She was a biologist, not a physicist, but she spoke with the confidence of someone trying to make sense of the impossible. "We're seeing ourselves in the future, or the past. The train ahead is us, but displaced in time." Walter called them back to the locomotive. He'd been trying to back up, to reverse away from the stopped train. But when he engaged reverse, the train didn't move. The wheels spun on the tracks, but they remained stationary. It was as if they were locked in place by some invisible force. And then they heard it. A whistle, coming from behind them. Another train approaching from the direction they'd come from. Philippa looked back and saw it. A third train, identical to theirs, approaching slowly. She could see people in the windows. She could see herself, standing in the rear car, looking forward. "We're stuck," Walter said, "between past and future versions of ourselves." The approaching train stopped right behind them, coupling gently against their rear car. Philippa walked back to the connection and saw the other conductor, wearing her face, wearing her uniform, staring back at her through the glass of the door. The other Philippa's lips moved. "Help us." Then she faded, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. The entire train faded, becoming translucent, then vanishing completely. But their train remained, solid and real, still stopped on the tracks between the abandoned train ahead and empty space behind. Dr. Koskinen had a theory. "We're in a time loop. The train ahead is us from the next loop. The train behind was us from the previous loop. We keep stopping here, seeing ourselves, trying to figure out what's happening, and then the loop resets." "How do we break it?" Gregory asked. "I don't know, but we need to do something we haven't done before, something that changes the pattern." They debated for hours. Turn back? But they couldn't reverse. Keep going? But the abandoned train blocked them. Wait? But for what? How long had they been waiting in previous loops? It was one of the other passengers. an elderly Cree woman named Edith Sutherland, who finally spoke. "The land doesn't want you here. This is a thin place, where the boundaries between times are weak. The train shouldn't run through here. My grandfather told stories about this area, said it was dangerous. That time didn't work right. The white men built the tracks anyway." "What do we do?" Philippa asked. "Show respect, make an offering, ask permission to pass." It sounded like superstition, but they were trapped between ghost trains in a time loop. Superstition seemed as logical as anything else at this point. Edith led them off the train. She walked to the front, to the space between their locomotive and the abandoned train ahead. From her bag, she took tobacco, a sacred medicine in Cree tradition, and began to pray in Cree, sprinkling the tobacco on the tracks. The wind stopped, the blowing snow settled, and in the sudden silence, they all heard it. A sound like breathing, deep and slow, coming from the land itself. The air shimmered between the two trains, and for a moment, Philippa saw something. Vast and old, something that existed in the landscape, something that the tracks had cut through, something that resented the intrusion. Edith finished her prayer. She made promises on behalf of the passengers, pledges to respect the land, to remember that they were guests here, traveling through a place that didn't belong to humans. The abandoned train ahead began to move, not forward but upward, lifting off the tracks, fading into the air like smoke. In seconds, it was gone. The tracks ahead were clear. Walter restarted the engine. This time, when he engaged forward, the train moved. They continued north, leaving that thin place behind. The rest of the journey to Churchill was uneventful. When they arrived, Philippa checked the logs and confirmed something terrifying. According to the official records, they were on time. The hours they'd spent stopped on the tracks, trapped in the time loop, had never happened according to the outside world. Time had held them, played with them, and then released them as if no time had passed at all. Philippa continued working the Hudson Bay route, but she never forgot what Edith taught her. Before every trip, she now carries tobacco. And when the train passes through that section of track where they'd been stopped, she whispers a prayer of respect, thanking the land for allowing them passage. The other crew members think it's just a quirk, a superstition she picked up from old-timers. But sometimes, late at night, when the train rolls through the vast emptiness of the Muskwa, Philippa looks out the window and sees things. Other trains, running on parallel tracks that don't exist. Lights in the forest where no lights should be. And once, just once, she saw herself looking back, standing beside the tracks, watching the train pass, a version of herself from a loop that never ended, trapped forever in that thin place where time doesn't work right. Story 5. The Hikers of Cathedral Mountain. In August of 2017, 4 friends embarked on a 5-day hiking trip in Yoho National Park, British Columbia. Noah Griffith, Samira Khalil, Trevor Donovan, and Bryn McAllister were experienced backpackers in their late 20s, and they'd planned a challenging route that would take them through some of the park's most remote terrain, culminating in a summit attempt of Cathedral Mountain. The first 3 days went perfectly. Clear weather, stunning vistas, and the kind of profound isolation that only wilderness can provide. They saw elk, mountain goats, and even a grizzly at a safe distance. They made camp at designated sites, filtered water from alpine streams, and fell asleep under stars so bright they seemed 3-dimensional. On the 4th day, they began their ascent of Cathedral Mountain. The trail was steep and challenging, but well marked. They'd planned to summit by late afternoon, then descend to a campsite halfway down to spend their final night before hiking out the next morning. They reached the summit at 4 p.m. The view was breathtaking. The entire valley spread below them, other peaks marching off to the horizon in every direction. They took pictures, ate energy bars, and signed the summit register, adding their names to the list of hikers who'd made it to this point. Trevor was the one who noticed the discrepancy. He was flipping through the summit register, reading other entries, when he stopped on a page dated August 15th, 2 days earlier. 4 names: Noah Griffith, Samira Khalil, Trevor Donovan, Bryn McAllister. Their names, in their handwriting, dated 2 days before they'd actually reached the summit. "This isn't funny," Trevor said, showing the others. "Who did this?" But they all recognized their own handwriting. Samira's distinctive cursive, Noah's blocky print, Bryn's artistic flourishes, and Trevor's efficient scrawl. It was impossible, but there it was. They'd signed the register 2 days before arriving. "Someone's messing with us," Noah said, though his voice was uncertain. "Maybe someone copied our names from social media. We posted about this trip." But they hadn't posted their route, or their summit date. And the signatures weren't just copied. They were perfect. Samira even noticed she'd made the same mistake in both signatures, looping the K and Khalil wrong, something she always did but never consciously noticed. Unnerved, they began their descent. The weather was changing, clouds rolling in fast, and they wanted to reach the campsite before dark. They moved quickly, perhaps too quickly, because that's when Bryn twisted her ankle on loose scree. Not badly, but enough that she needed to move slowly and carefully. As they helped her down the trail, the fog rolled in. Thick, impenetrable fog that reduced visibility to a few meters. They'd been on this trail 3 hours earlier in bright sunshine, but now everything looked different. The markers seemed to be in the wrong places. The trail branched in ways they didn't remember. Noah consulted his GPS. The screen flickered, showing their position, then showing an error, then showing them in a completely different location several kilometers away. "Something's wrong with the satellite signal," he said. "The fog shouldn't interfere like this." They kept moving, trying to follow the trail by feel, but it became increasingly obvious that they were lost. The trail had vanished entirely, and they were navigating through fog-shrouded rocks and stunted alpine trees, the ground dropping away sharply on sides they couldn't see. That's when they heard the voices. Their own voices. Through the fog, echoing weirdly off the rocks, they heard themselves talking. Samira heard herself laughing. Trevor heard himself curse as he stumbled. Noah heard himself suggest they stop and wait for the fog to clear. Bryn heard herself agree. They stood frozen, listening to themselves have a conversation they weren't having, their voices coming from somewhere ahead in the fog, invisible but undeniably real. "Hello?" Samira called out. The voices stopped. Then, after a moment, they heard Samira's voice call back. "Hello?" "This isn't happening," Bryn whispered. But it was. They were hearing themselves, somewhere ahead in the fog, as if walking a parallel path. Sometimes the voices seemed close, sometimes distant. At one point they heard the distinctive sound of someone falling, a cry of pain, and Noah's voice shouting Bryn's name. "That was when I twisted my ankle," Bryn realized. "But that was an hour ago. We're hearing ourselves from earlier." Or were they hearing themselves from the future? Or from another timeline entirely? The fog made everything uncertain, reality bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. They tried to make camp, to wait out the fog, but they couldn't find level ground. Every direction seemed to lead downward, and the slope was growing steeper. They were forced to keep moving, clinging to each other, their headlamps creating halos in the fog that revealed nothing useful. Hours passed. It should have been dark by now, but the fog glowed with diffuse light that came from no visible source. Time felt wrong. Noah's watch showed 8 p.m. Then when he looked again a minute later, it showed 7:45. Trevor's phone had stopped working entirely. The GPS was useless, spinning their location in circles. And always, the voices. Sometimes their own voices from hours ago. Sometimes voices they didn't recognize. Other hikers, perhaps, calling out in confusion and fear. Sometimes they heard their own names being called by voices that sounded like them but weren't quite right. The inflection off, the tone hollow. It was Samira who first saw them. Figures in the fog, moving parallel to their group. She counted 4 figures, the same number as their party, walking in perfect synchronization with their movements. When they stopped, the figures stopped. When they moved, the figures moved. "We need to follow them," Trevor said. "Maybe they know the way." "Or maybe they're following us," Noah replied. "Maybe they're as lost as we are." They called out to the figures, but received no response. The figures just kept walking, shadows in the fog, always the same distance away, no matter how fast or slow the group moved. Dawn should have come, but it didn't. The fog remained, the diffuse glow neither brightening nor dimming. They'd been walking for what felt like 10 hours, but their watches showed impossible times, jumping forward and backward, making it impossible to track how long they'd been lost. Exhaustion was setting in. Bryn's ankle had swollen badly. Their water was running low. They were starting to make mistakes, stumbling over rocks they should have seen, walking too close to edges they couldn't see until the ground started to crumble under their feet. That's when Noah realized what was happening. He'd been thinking about the summit register, about their names dated 2 days earlier. "We're stuck in a loop," he said. "We keep hiking the same stretch of mountain over and over. That's why we hear our own voices. It's not us from earlier, it's us from the last loop. And those figures in the fog, that's us from the next loop." "That's impossible," Samira said, but her voice held no conviction. "We need to break the pattern," Noah continued. "We need to do something different, something we haven't done before in any of the previous loops." But how could they know what they'd done before? They had no memory of previous loops, if loops even existed. Every decision felt like the first time making it. Trevor had an idea. He took out his knife and carved an arrow into a large rock, pointing downhill. "If we see this arrow again, we'll know we're looping, and we'll know to go a different direction." They continued hiking, following the arrow's direction. The fog remained thick, but after another hour of stumbling descent, they saw it. The rock, the arrow, pointing uphill now, from their new perspective. They'd looped back to exactly where they'd been. "Okay," Bryn said, her voice shaky with exhaustion and fear. "What do we do?" They ignored the arrow and walked perpendicular to it, straight across the slope, which felt wrong and dangerous, the ground tilting unnaturally. But after 20 minutes of this sideways traverse, something changed. The fog began to thin. They could see further than a few meters for the first time in hours. And ahead, impossibly, they saw the trail. The actual marked trail, with a clear sign indicating the way to the campsite. They ran toward it, not caring about caution anymore, just desperate to reach something real and marked and designed for human navigation. They reached the trail, and the fog vanished as if it had never existed. They were standing on a familiar stretch of path, the sun bright overhead, the valley visible below. According to their phones and watches, it was still August 18th, 4 p.m., the exact time they'd summited. As if no time had passed at all. But they were exhausted, their water was depleted, and Bryn's ankle was swollen and bruised. They made it to the campsite and tried to process what had happened. A mass hallucination? But they'd all experienced the exact same things. A pocket of reality where time didn't work correctly. But that was impossible. Wasn't it? That night, Trevor kept watch while the others slept fitfully. At 3 a.m., he heard voices. Their voices. coming from up the mountain, from the direction of the summit. He heard himself laugh. He heard Samira say they should descend before the weather changed. He heard Noah mention the weird entry in the summit register. The voices faded, moving away from him, back into the mountain. In the morning, they hiked out as quickly as Bryn's ankle would allow. They didn't talk about what happened. They made a silent, mutual agreement not to speak of it, not to report it, not to try to explain it to park rangers or friends or family. But sometimes, late at night, each of them wonders, are they still there? Is some version of them still trapped in that fog, still walking in circles on Cathedral Mountain, leaving signatures in the summit register that date to days they haven't lived yet? Are they the originals, or are they the echoes? Did they escape the loop, or did the loop spit them out because the mountain was done with them? And sometimes, other hikers on Cathedral Mountain report strange experiences. Fog that comes from nowhere. Voices that sound like their own. Figures walking parallel to them in the mist. And they find entries in the summit register. Names in handwriting that matches their own. Dated to days they haven't arrived yet. Proving that whatever happened to Noah, Samira, Trevor, and Bryn wasn't unique. The mountain has its loops, its pockets of broken time, and it's waiting patiently for the next hikers to get lost in the fog and spend eternity walking the same trail over and over, forever approaching a destination they'll never reach. Story 6. The Portrait Gallery of Old Montreal. Isabelle Duchesne worked as a night security guard at the Musée d'Art Historique in Old Montreal, a small private museum housed in a building that dated back to 1723. The museum specialized in colonial-era art and artifacts, including an extensive collection of portraits from the 17 and 1800s. It was quiet work, walking the galleries with only a flashlight and the glow of emergency lighting, ensuring no one broke in and nothing was disturbed. Isabelle had been working there for 3 months when she first noticed the portraits were different. It was subtle at first. A painting she'd walked past hundreds of times, a portrait of a merchant named Barnabé Coté, painted in 1749, seemed slightly off. The man's eyes, which she'd always remembered as looking slightly to the left, now appeared to be looking straight ahead, directly at the viewer, directly at her. She convinced herself she'd misremembered. The lighting was dim, and late-night shifts played tricks on perception. But the next night, another portrait had changed. A woman named Marguerite Fontaine, painted in 1783, whose hands had been folded in her lap, now had one hand raised slightly, as if reaching toward something outside the frame. Isabelle began documenting the portraits with her phone, taking pictures each night to compare. The changes were undeniable, slow but progressive. Eyes shifted, hands moved, expressions altered from neutral to concerned to, in some cases, fearful. The subjects in the paintings were moving. She brought it to the museum director's attention, showing him her documented evidence. Director Gilles Moreau was skeptical, but agreed to examine the portraits. He brought in an art conservator who verified that the paintings hadn't been physically altered. The paint was original, the craquelure patterns consistent with their age. There was no tampering, no forgery. Whatever Isabelle was documenting, it wasn't the result of someone sneaking in and modifying the art. Old paintings can seem to change under different lighting conditions, the conservator explained. The way shadows fall, the angle of view, the humidity in the air affecting how paint reflects light. What you're perceiving as movement is likely just variations in observation. But Isabelle knew what she was seeing. The portraits were changing every night, and the changes were accelerating. The subjects weren't just moving their eyes or hands anymore. They were moving across the paintings entirely. Barnabé Coté, who'd been standing in his study with bookshelves behind him, was now standing closer to the front of the frame, his hand pressed against an invisible barrier, his face twisted in distress. On the 9th night of documenting the changes, Isabel heard something that made her blood run cold. Whispers, coming from the portrait gallery. She stood in the main hall, her flashlight trained down the corridor where the portraits hung, and listened. Multiple voices, muffled and distant, all speaking at once. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Desperation. Isabel walked slowly into the portrait gallery. 37 paintings hung on the walls. Portraits of merchants, clergy, colonists, and indigenous leaders from Quebec's early history. And from each one, she heard whispering. The painted faces had all turned toward her, every single subject now looking directly at her, their mouths moving in silent speech. She aimed her flashlight at the nearest portrait, Marguerite Fontaine. The woman's face was pressed against the front of the canvas now, her hands splayed flat as if against glass. Her mouth moved frantically, and Isabel realized she could read her lips. "Let us out. Please, let us out." All of them. Every portrait, every painted face pleading for escape, their voices trapped behind layers of oil and canvas, desperate to break free. Isabel ran from the gallery and called Director Moreau immediately. He arrived within the hour, bringing with him a priest named Father Rousseau. The three of them stood in the portrait gallery, and Moreau's face went white as he saw what Isabel had been documenting. The subjects were no longer in their original positions. They were all crowded at the fronts of their frames, hands pressed against invisible barriers, faces contorted in terror. Father Rousseau began to pray, but Isabel interrupted him. "Wait, look at this." She pointed to a plague on the wall, information about the portrait collection. These paintings were all completed by the same artist, François Pelletier. He worked in Montreal from 1745 until his death in 1802. He was incredibly prolific, painting over 300 portraits during his career. "I know Pelletier's work," Moreau said. "He was renowned for his lifelike quality. People said his portraits captured not just appearance but essence, the soul of the subject." Isabel felt the pieces clicking together. What if he didn't just capture their souls metaphorically? What if he literally captured them, trapped them in the paintings? It sounded insane, but they were standing in a gallery full of moving portraits, watching painted people beg for freedom. Sanity had left the building hours ago. They researched François Pelletier's history. He'd been reclusive, working alone in a studio that no one was permitted to enter. His technique was secret, his methods mysterious. And according to historical records, several of his subjects had died shortly after their portraits were completed. Heart failure, sudden illness, accidents. At the time, it was attributed to coincidence. But now, Father Rousseau suggested an exorcism, a ritual to free the trapped souls. But Moreau was hesitant. The paintings were historically valuable, part of Quebec's cultural heritage. Destroying them or tampering with them in any way would be catastrophic for the museum. They compromised on a ritual blessing, something Father Rousseau could do that wouldn't damage the physical paintings. They gathered all 37 portraits in the main gallery, arranged them in a circle, and Father Rousseau began his prayers. The response was immediate and violent. The painted figures began to scream, their voices finally breaking through whatever barrier had kept them muffled. The gallery filled with the sound of dozens of people shrieking in terror and rage, a cacophony that seemed to vibrate through the building's walls. The paintings shook on their hooks, several falling to the floor. The subjects thrashed against the confines of their frames, their movements becoming more frantic, more violent. And then, one by one, the portraits began to burn, not with normal fire, but with cold blue flames that consumed the canvas from within, leaving the ornate frames untouched. The flames spread from painting to painting, and as each one burned, a figure stepped out. Translucent, ghostly but undeniably present. Barnabé Coté emerged from his portrait, followed by Marguerite Fontaine, followed by 35 others. They stood in the gallery, looking at their hands, their bodies, as if unable to believe they were free. One by one, they faded, crossing over to whatever comes after death, finally released from 200 years of imprisonment. The last to go was a young woman whose portrait had been dated 1767. She looked at Isabel with tears streaming down her translucent face and mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Then she was gone, and the gallery was empty except for 37 ornate frames holding nothing but ash. The museum closed for 6 months while Moreau dealt with the loss of the collection. He explained it as a tragic fire, cause unknown. The insurance investigation found no evidence of accelerant or electrical failure. The frames survived, antique wood barely singed, while the canvas and paint had been completely consumed. It defied explanation. Isabel quit her job at the museum. She couldn't walk those halls anymore without feeling the weight of what had happened. But she researched François Pelletier's other works. 300 portraits he'd painted. 37 had been freed. That left 263 unaccounted for, scattered in private collections, museums, and estates across Canada and beyond. Sometimes, late at night, Isabel searches online auction sites and gallery listings, looking for portraits attributed to François Pelletier. And when she finds them, she reaches out to the owners. She tells them to look closely at their paintings, to watch for changes, to listen for whispers, because somewhere in homes and galleries across the world, people are trapped in oil and canvas, and they're begging for someone to hear them, to see them, to set them free. Story 7. The broadcast from Flin Flon. Radio DJ Camille Bergeron hosted the midnight to 6 a.m. shift at CFAR, a small radio station in Flin Flon, Manitoba. The town straddled the border between Manitoba and Saskatchewan, a mining community of 5,000 people surrounded by boreal forest and countless lakes. The overnight shift was lonely work, but Camille loved it. She'd play a mix of classic rock and local requests, chat with the occasional insomniac caller, and enjoy the quiet solitude of the broadcast booth. CFAR had been broadcasting since 1957, one of the oldest stations in northern Manitoba. The equipment was vintage, lovingly maintained but showing its age. The station manager, Frank, kept promising to upgrade everything, but the budget never seemed to stretch far enough. So Camille worked with turntables that needed constant adjustment, a mixing board with temperamental knobs, and microphones that sometimes picked up strange interference. It started in November of 2020. Camille was midway through her shift, spinning Fleetwood Mac and reading the weather forecast when the interference began. It cut through her broadcast, a low-frequency hum that pulsed in rhythm. She adjusted the equipment, thinking it was a loose connection, but the interference persisted. Then, underneath the hum, she heard voices. Faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. They spoke in fragments, words cutting in and out. "Can anyone hear? We need..." So cold. Camille killed her broadcast and isolated the interference on the mixing board. The voices became clearer. They were calling for help. Multiple people, their voices overlapping, all desperate. She tried to respond over the microphone, asking who they were, where they were calling from, but they didn't seem to hear her. They just kept pleading, their voices rising in panic. The interference lasted 3 minutes, then cut out completely. Camille sat in the booth, her hands shaking. She called Frank, woke him up, and explained what happened. He was skeptical, but promised to check the equipment in the morning. The next night, it happened again. Same time. 3:47 a.m. The interference cut through whatever song was playing, and the voices returned. This time, Camille recorded it, The voices were clearer now, and she could make out more distinct phrases. The water is rising. We can't get out. Please, someone help us. And then, chillingly, can anyone hear us? This is November 15th, 1984. 1984. 36 years ago. Camille researched CFAR's broadcast history. In November of 1984, the station had been off the air for 3 days due to a transmitter failure. She found old newspaper archives, searched for any incidents that might have happened during those 3 days. And she found it. A mining accident. Cave-in at the zinc mine. 12 miners trapped underground for 4 days before rescue crews reached them. 7 had survived. 5 had not. The interference continued every night at 3:47 a.m. Always the same voices, always the same desperate calls for help. Camille began to recognize individual voices. There was Theo, who kept calling for his wife. There was Javier, who repeatedly said he couldn't breathe. There was Duncan, the youngest, 19 years old, who cried for his mother. Frank finally came in to investigate. He brought an engineer who examined every piece of equipment in the station, testing for faults, checking signal paths, searching for any logical explanation. They found nothing wrong. The equipment was old but functional. There was no source for the interference. But at 3:47 a.m., with Frank and the engineer in the booth with Camille, the voices came through. Clear as day, 12 men trapped in darkness, calling out to a world that couldn't hear them in 1984. Their voices somehow caught in the radio waves, replaying night after night. The engineer went pale. Frank made the sign of the cross, and he wasn't even Catholic. And Camille listened as Duncan cried for his mother, his voice breaking with terror and hopelessness. They're trapped, Camille said quietly. Not in the mine anymore, in the broadcast. Somehow their distress call got caught in the radio waves 36 years ago, and it's been looping ever since. They're stuck in that moment, calling for help that never comes. Frank wanted to shut down the overnight broadcast, but Camille refused. If we stop broadcasting, if we shut down the transmitter, we're abandoning them, again. Someone needs to be here. Someone needs to listen. So Camille continued her overnight shifts. Every night at 3:47 a.m., she'd lower the music and let the voices through. She'd respond, even though they couldn't hear her, telling them they weren't alone, that someone was listening, that someone remembered them. She researched the 5 who died in the cave-in. Theo Martins, 43, married with 3 kids. Javier Ruiz, 37, new immigrant from Honduras. Duncan Kelly, 19, just graduated high school. Patrick Lund, 56, 6 months from retirement. Robert Gagnon, 28, engaged to be married that December. Camille found their families, the ones still living in Flin Flon or nearby. She told them about the broadcasts. Some thought she was crazy. Others came to the station and listened. Duncan's mother, now in her 70s, sat in the broadcast booth and wept as she heard her son's voice calling for her across 36 years. "I heard him," she whispered. "I never got to say goodbye, but I heard him." The interference continued for 6 months, and then, one night in May, it changed. The voices came through as always at 3:47 a.m., but this time they were different. Calmer. The panic was gone. Instead, Camille heard them talking to each other, their words clear. "Do you think anyone hears us? Someone's listening. I can feel it. We're not forgotten." And then Duncan's voice, young and scared but somehow peaceful. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering." The interference faded away. It never came back. Camille still hosts the overnight shift at CFR, and every night at 3:47 a.m., she goes quiet for 3 minutes. No music, no talk, just silence. a memorial for 12 men trapped in darkness, 5 of whom never made it home. A reminder that voices can echo across time, that desperate calls for help can travel further than we imagine, and that sometimes the dead just need someone to listen, to remember, to acknowledge that they existed and suffered and deserve to be mourned. If you're ever driving through Flin Flon late at night, and you tune into CFAR at 3:47 a.m., you'll hear that silence. And if you listen carefully, very carefully, you might hear something underneath. Not the voices of the trapped miners. Something else. The sound of radio waves themselves, carrying countless signals, countless voices, all of them traveling through the air around us, invisible and unheard. And you'll wonder how many other messages are out there, how many other desperate calls are trapped in the electromagnetic spectrum, waiting for someone to hear them, waiting to be remembered. Story 8. The Hunters of Muskwa. Brothers Elijah and Marcus Tremblay ran a wilderness guiding service out of Fort Nelson, British Columbia. They specialized in hunting expeditions into the Muskwa Management Area, one of the largest protected wilderness areas in North America. Over 2 million hectares of pristine forest, mountain, and river, home to grizzlies, wolves, caribou, and some of the most challenging terrain in Canada. In October of 2018, they took on a client named Peter Ashford, a wealthy American businessman who wanted to hunt moose. Peter was experienced and well-equipped, and he'd paid premium rates for a 2-week expedition deep into the wilderness. The brothers led him 50 kilometers from the nearest road, into a valley the Cascadena people had traditionally avoided, though Elijah and Marcus didn't know why. The first week went well. They tracked moose, saw abundant wildlife, and Peter proved to be a competent outdoorsman. The weather held, cold but clear, perfect hunting conditions. They'd set up a base camp in a clearing beside a glacial stream, with a view of the mountains that took Peter's breath away. On the 8th night, Marcus woke to silence. Complete, absolute silence. No wind in the trees, no stream burbling, no night birds or small animals rustling in the undergrowth. The kind of silence that only happens when every living thing is hiding. He shook Elijah awake. His brother felt it too, that wrongness in the air. They grabbed their rifles and stepped out of their tent. The moon was full, casting the forest in silver light. Peter emerged from his tent, his face pale. "You feel it too?" he whispered. They did. Something was watching them. Something large, moving through the forest just beyond the firelight. They could hear it now, the subtle crunch of footsteps on forest floor, deliberate and slow, circling their camp. Elijah raised his rifle, aiming his flashlight into the darkness. "This is bear country. Stay close to the fire." But what emerged from the trees was not a bear. It walked on 2 legs, humanoid but wrong, standing nearly 3 meters tall. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its arms hung too long, knuckles nearly dragging the ground. But the face, dear God, the face was almost human. High cheekbones, a broad nose, eyes that reflected the firelight with an intelligence that was unmistakably conscious. It watched them with those eyes, assessing, calculating. Marcus raised his rifle, but Elijah put a hand on the barrel, pushing it down. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't shoot." The creature tilted its head, and Marcus could have sworn it smiled. Then it turned and vanished into the forest with impossible speed for something so large. The 3 men stood frozen by the fire until dawn. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They'd all seen it. The question was, what had they seen? When daylight came, Elijah and Marcus packed up camp. The expedition was over. They needed to leave. But Peter insisted on seeing where the creature had stood, examining the tracks it left behind. The prints were enormous, 45 centimeters long, showing 5 distinct toes and what looked like claw marks. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth. "We need to follow it," Peter said. "Absolutely not," Elijah replied. "We're leaving." But Peter had already started following the tracks. He had a strange expression on his face, a mixture of fear and fascination. Elijah and Marcus exchanged glances and followed him, rifles ready. They couldn't let their client wander off alone. The tracks led deeper into the forest, away from their camp, climbing into rockier terrain. After an hour of tracking, they found something that stopped them cold. A cave entrance, partially hidden by fallen trees and undergrowth. The tracks led inside. And around the entrance, arranged with clear intentionality, were bones. Human bones. Skulls placed on rocks like sentinels. Long bones arranged in geometric patterns. A warning or a welcome. "We're leaving," Marcus said firmly. "Now." But Peter had already entered the cave. Cursing, the brothers followed him inside, their flashlights cutting through absolute darkness. The cave went deeper than seemed possible, the walls smoothing out as they progressed, becoming less natural, more deliberately carved. Someone, or something, had shaped this space. They found Peter standing in a large chamber, his flashlight playing across the walls. And there, painted in what looked like ochre and charcoal, were images. Hundreds of images. Human figures hunting animals, human figures building fires, and towering above them in every image, watching over them, were the creatures. Protectors? Gods? The images suggested both. "The Casca people told stories," Elijah said quietly, his voice echoing in the chamber. "About giants in the mountains. The Nukluk. They said the giants were here before humans, that they watched over the land. Some stories said they were benevolent. Others said they demanded tribute." "Tribute," Marcus repeated. He swept his flashlight across the floor of the chamber. More bones. But these weren't arranged as warnings. They were piled, hundreds of them. Animal bones, yes, but also human. Offerings, brought here over centuries. A sound echoed from deeper in the cave system. A low rumble that wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite speech. It vibrated through the rock walls, through their chests. More sounds answered it. Multiple voices calling back and forth in the darkness beyond their flashlight beams. They ran. All three of them, abandoning equipment, abandoning dignity, running through the cave tunnel as the sounds grew louder behind them. They burst out into daylight and didn't stop running until they reached their camp. They grabbed only the essentials and fled, hiking through the night until they reached their vehicle 50 kilometers away. Peter returned to the States and never spoke to the brothers again. Elijah and Marcus never guided expeditions into that valley again. They told other guides to avoid it, though they couldn't explain why without sounding insane. But sometimes, on clear nights in Fort Nelson, the brothers stand outside and look toward the mountains, and they wonder about the Nukluk, about those enormous figures living in the deepest wilderness. They wonder if the creatures are truly alone, or if there are more of them, hidden in caves and valleys across the north. They wonder if the old stories were warnings that should have been heeded. And they remember those eyes, so disturbingly human, watching them from the darkness with ancient, patient intelligence.